Okay everyone, I'll be showing you how to go about mounting your Capra cage to a standard Tamiya TT-02 chassis. First, there's a few modifications to the chassis that need to be made. You need to cut off the body post tabs on the front and the rear shock towers. And you need to cut out a section of the tub along this edge where it's got this protruding section, as this will interfere with the lower section of the Capra cage. And those three modifications are all you have to do for your chassis. On the cage, there's a few more. You have to remove the boat sides from the bottom. On a standard cage, there'll be these two large plates along the bottom. What I did was took a hacksaw to them just to cut them off. I could also use an X-Acto or a cutoff wheel. I tried all three, they all work. Pick your poison of which way you want to remove it, but those have to go. In the rear, you have to remove the rear wall from the inside of the cage in order to clear the motor and the battery tray. And you have to remove the lower bars between these lower rails and this rear rail in order to clear the rear suspension. And that is all you have to modify on the cage. As far as printed parts, you'll be printing out a rear hinge, a front chassis cross member for the internal body post, as well as the chassis side mount for the front internal body post. Starting off with the rear hinge, this is a 4-piece hinge. It's got this lower section that mounts to the upper arm capture. It has a rear plate that will bolt into the shock towers, and it's got these two uprights which will hold this hinge, which is just a metal tube with a 3mm inner diameter. So I printed all of these out so that any and all holes were perpendicular to the print bed, and then glued it all together in order to make this as strong as possible. This center hinge needs to be cut to the distance between the shock tower mounts in the Capra cage. I believe it is 55mm, but I'll have to double check. Once you have this glued together and this hinge rod installed, you're able to install this into the cage. You have to install this into the cage first, as there's no way to install it from underneath because of how the Capra cage is designed. So what you'll do, make sure that your shock tower plate is to the back. You'll drop it in, and you'll install 2 bolts through the shock tower holes in the rearmost hole. I'm using probably 30mm bolts. These are quite long. They don't need to be this long. Just long enough that they go through the cage and into the hinge. Okay, once you install those 2 bolts, this is what your rear hinge system should look like. With this rear plate to the back, it should move freely. And now this section of the cage is done. Now we'll move on to the front body mounting system. This will bolt in to this point here of the rear of the front arm capture. For this, there's only 3 parts that need to be printed. A cross brace that will go between the front shock tower mounts in the Capra cage, as well as a 2-part chassis side body post capture. This consists of a lower plate and an upright. The upright is glued to the front edge of the lower plate, and it has recesses for TT-02 body posts. For this, you'll be using standard front body posts cut down in order to clear the cage. I cut this to have only 3 holes left, then cut off a flat section here so I was able to drill a hole perpendicular to the standard holes. This will allow you to actually install the clips when they're in the vehicle. So first, you're going to take this part and you're going to install it into the chassis with this upright to the front of the vehicle. For this, you'll use either standard TT-02 bolts, or you can use some M3s. For this, I'm going to just use some standard TT-02 bolts. You have to install these first, as they are not accessible once the body posts are installed. Just make sure those are tight and make this secure. Then you can take your body posts. These will be a fairly tight fit at first. Once you've taken them apart and reinstalled them a few times, they'll go together a little smoother. They just press in. They'll be pretty tight. Just like that. Both body posts are installed. Then you will take a couple more bolts. I'm using the standard bolts for attaching the body posts from the TT-02, and these will be installed through the front and into the body posts. At this point, your front body post system is finished, and you're able to move on to the cage side of this mount. For mounting to the cage, this piece is going to be installed in the front, where the battery tray used to be, between these two shock tower mounts. The way this mounts is this angled portion will be mounted forward, and this recessed slot will be mounted up. This will simply slide in place. You may have to loosen the bolt that attaches this cross member, as it makes this section of the cage quite tight for how I designed it. It will just sit in place there. From there, you'll take 4 bolts. Mine are all rather uneven. They're just ones I had lying around. Likely about 10 to 15 millimeters in length in order to pass all the way through the cage and into this plastic. Okay, once you get that front mount installed, it'll look something like this. Mounts will be installed in the front of the cage, and the bolts will be mounted into the front and the rear holes for the shock towers. From here, you'll now be able to mount this cage to your TT-02 chassis. So you'll take the chassis, line up these holes in the front body mount with the body posts, and it'll just rest in place just like that. From here, you can take 2 bolts. I'm using the bolts for mounting the standard Tamiya bumpers, the longer bolts, in order to mount those. And I am mounting those in through the top, to these top holes. One bolt's a little stripped out, I'll have to replace that. Anyways, from here, you'll be mounting this rear portion of the cage in place. For this, I'm using a couple of longer bolts. This way you can use the standard TT-02 shocks and mount it between your lower arm and either of these 2 holes. They'll both work, as they'll both clear the cage when it hinges. Or, when I make it available, you can mount in a rear shock tower, which will allow you to run 70 millimeter shocks in place of the standard 55 millimeter Tamiya shocks. For this, you'll take these bolts and you can install it into either of the 2 holes on each side in order to secure the rear of the hinge in place. Just like that, the rear of the hinge is now mounted. Again, this will work with standard Tamiya 55mm shocks as well as with the mount I'm still working on. Allow you to mount 70mm shocks. Either way will work. In the front, now you're able to mount your standard Tamiya shocks between your lower arms and your shock towers. Or again, still work in progress. I'm working on a front shock tower to be able to run 70mm shocks in the front of the vehicle as well. For this, I'm using a couple of shorter bolts. I believe these are 7 or 8mm in length. Just enough to go through this shock tower and into the, just to go between the shock tower and the standard Tamiya shock tower. Again, this front will work with or without the shock tower. Without, you can run 55mm. With, you can run 70s. From here, you'll mount your shocks. I'm going to be using these basic RC four-wheel drive 70mm scale shocks. They'll mount between the upper towers and the lower arms. In the rear, I'll do the same. Again, mounting between shock towers and the lower arms. Again, using 70mm shocks. Once your shocks are all installed, the last thing to do will be to install your hood, your body clips, and you'll be ready to drive. Standard Capra hood, obviously. A couple of short bolts to secure them to the hinge. Just like that, your Capra cage is now mounted to a TT-02 chassis. With this, in order to fully secure it using the body clips, I took some standard TT-02 body clips and angled up the ends so that they're able to be grabbed when they're inside the vehicle. These just clip in place through the internal body posts. Sometimes they're a little hard to find, especially when you're not looking at it from above. Just like that. The internal mount is secure. Now you'll mount the clips for the front hinge latches. And just like that, the cage is fully mounted and ready to drive. Thank you for watching.